So initializing the database is not just about setting up the connections, but instead it also means that we have to deal with table creation. And for that, I'll add a new function here in this db.go file, which I'll name create tables, because that is exactly what this function should do. It should create a bunch of tables in that database in case they don't exist yet. So for that, for example, I'll add a new variable here, which I'll call create events table. And in there, I want to store a string that contains the SQL statement that will create this events table. Now I will actually write this string across multiple lines to make it easier to read, and I'll therefore use this alternative way of creating strings that you can use in Go, where you use backticks to create a string. Because when using backticks, you can actually write your string across multiple lines, and that simply makes it a bit more readable. And then the SQL command we need here is create table if not exists. Then we define the table name, events in my case here. And then between parentheses, we configure this table. So now we set up all the different columns we want to have in there and which data types will be stored in these columns. For example, I want to have an ID because every event will have an ID, which should be of type integer, which should also be the primary key of an event, so the main identifier, and which should be created automatically by automatically incrementing a number, so that the first event receives an ID of 1, the second event an ID of 2, and so on. Then we'll also need to store a name. And of course here I'm simply replicating the event structure I have here in my struct. So I want to have a name, which should be of type text, and which must not be null. Then thereafter a description, which must be text that should not be null. And then a location, which also is text and not null. Thereafter also the datetime, which is of type datetime, a special type that is supported by SQL, and which must not be null. And a user ID, which should be of type integer. Later, we'll also add more tables and connect these tables with each other, but for the moment, that's it. Now, this also is a new variable that's created on the fly, so we need this operator. And with that variable that contains this SQL statement, we can now execute this SQL query here, this statement, whenever the program starts, so whenever the server starts. So that every time it starts, we check if we have that table, and if we do nothing, but if we don't, we create it with that shape here, with that structure. So to do that, we must use this query here, this variable, and use our database, so this global variable that contains this pointer to this database handle, you could say. And on this database, we can call exec to execute a query statement. And here I pass this variable to exec, which contains this SQL statement that will be executed. Now exec will return a result value and an error if things go wrong. And I don't care about the result. I will care about results later when we send other queries where we, for example, fetch data. But here I don't care about it. Instead, I only care about the error that we might have, and I'll check if error is not equal to nil, in which case I also want to panic and say could not create events table. Something like this. Now we just must make sure that create tables is executed, and therefore I'll do this here after successfully going through that init process. I'll then also call create tables to create all these tables. So with that, we finished this initDB logic, but there are two things that should be improved in this code. One problem is down here with that create events table query, because in there we should have a comma after this first column here, this ID column. That's important. And in addition, we can go to the main.go file and call initDB on our DB package. And of course, you also must add the import. And once you did that, you can run this program, and it might take some time until it starts. It's not necessarily as fast as it was for me here, but then eventually it should start, and you should find this API DB file in your project. And that will contain that database data later, and we'll talk to that file through the SQL package and the SQLite 3 package. And with that, we can now stop that server again and now start working on some code that will actually interact with that database so that we store events in the database and we fetch events from the database.